Hello everybody, welcome to this video where I'm going to be just barely scratching the surface of how to win an argument. Let me know if you guys want me to make more videos like this on logic, how to win arguments, how to argue correctly on fallacies. I saw that my video for the tu quoque argument got a lot of views, so thank you. And I thought I'd just talk a little bit about some stuff I know and I've read from some books. But as I mentioned, if you want me to, I can make more videos. I can, go back to my books, pick up specific things to mention and to talk about. In this video, I'm just going to be talking very generally about some stuff that can help you win an argument. And if you like it, just let me know and I'll make more videos on it. Or just let me know with the views, right? The views are pretty good. Okay, so in this case, I'm starting to think, well, I'm thinking of starting like a logical section also in my channel. But anyway, I read a book a while back called How to Win Any Argument. And what I remember most from that book, I haven't opened it yet, but what I remember it when I read it is demographics. Demographics are super important when it comes to evidence, when it comes to statistics, when it comes to data, basically when it comes to facts. So if you ever find yourself in an argument with another person and they start telling you like, oh, 60% of people, or based on the studies conducted by XYZ universities, or, it's a fact that, you can go to demographics. Demographics basically means who were the people that were tested, evaluated, questioned, right? Who were they? Were they mostly men or women? Were they in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s, in their 60s, 70s? Were they single, married? Did they have a high school education? Did they have a college education? Did they have a master's education? All of these things is basically like, and I'll give you an example. Like you can have maybe a national survey, right? And let's say in XYZ country, X country, you have a national survey, and the North is mainly, let's say, right wing, and the South is left wing, right? And you go and ask the people in the North what they think about the right wing candidate, right? And let's say 98% of them say they favor the candidate, right? They like him or her or whatever. And you publish that study, right? That survey, and you say, look, 98% of, the national sentiment is that, this candidate is favorable for the country, blah, 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 right? And again, it's like, where did you conduct that study, right? Not so much where did you get that information from, but where did the people that did that study, that survey, that the people that got that information, where did they get it from, right? So it's like a double where, right? You go back, where did they get it from, right? You could ask the person, where did you get it from? But where did the people that you got it from, where did they get it from, right? And again, it's all about demographics, which if you think about it, it's like demos, like people, and then graphics is like the representation of, the physical representation of those people, right? Of the people, like democracy, demographics, right? So you got to take into consideration all of these things when people talk about statistics or evidence or, surveys being done or whatever. It's like, but who are these people that are being questioned, right? Because, again, and here we get into the terrain of it has to be a representative sample, right? Of course, you can't ask every single person in the country, right? So you have to ask like, if there's a million people in the country, you may have to ask only like 100 people at the most or something like that, right? 10 or 1,000 or whatever. Well, that sample, it's called a sample, that sample has to be representative, right? It has to tell you what most of the people in the country think, for example. And how is that achieved? Well, that's very hard. because you can have bias in your study, in your evidence, in your survey, sometimes without you even knowing. So that's something that you can also argue to win any argument. Okay, the other thing I'm going to get into is the reasoning behind certain statements that people may make. So when someone makes an argument, what you can do first is push to know the reasoning behind it, right? So if someone states, it's raining outside, right? That's my statement. It's raining outside. Immediately you can ask, well, what are your reasons for saying that, right? How do you know that? Why do you know that? Oh, because I looked out the window and there was rain falling from the sky, right? Your car is wet, right? The street is wet, right? Again, that doesn't mean that it's raining, but you can say, well, I just looked 2 seconds ago and there's clearly rain falling from the sky, right? So what you really want to know is what is the reasoning behind people's statements. Excuse me. And here we get into the terrain of, is it true or is it false, right? Where in logic, it's like, is it a correct argument or is it an incorrect argument, right? Now, if someone's making a statement just out of the blue, like the sky is purple or something like that, and you ask them why, why do you think that, or what's the reasoning behind that, and they just kind of go like, well, I just like to think it is, or whatever, right? Well, you can obviously see that there's no correct link there, right? So it's invalid, it's not true, right? So the reasoning behind people's arguments sometimes may be weak, right? And see, in logic, what logic tells us is that the conclusion must follow the premises, right? Now, the way I like to think about this, technical logic jargon is basically like you have a consequence, right? You have a reason, you have a consequence, you have a result, or you have an effect, right? That's the statement I'm making. And what I want to know is, what are your reasons for that, which is what are the causes for you thinking, right? For your thinking of that, right? So the reason sometimes may not be there, or they may be weak, or they may not follow the conclusion, right? Which in this case would be the effect, the reason. So you can tell someone, or someone can say, well, I had a really fun time at Marty's house yesterday. You can say, why do you say that? Well, because when I got there, he greeted me very friendly. And it's like, well, but how does that connect to your whole evening being amazing? And the person can just say, well, I guess it really doesn't, right? And it's a weak connection, right? So when you exploit, or when you basically make the causes known, if there even are any, sometimes they may have a weak link, right? Or just no link at all, like no logical link, right? To the effect, to the statement being made, or the conclusion being made, right? So this is the way that you can destroy weak reasoning, right? And you can also expose it by repeating it, right? So in this case, if you repeat it, what you're going to end up doing is basically getting that out, right? That information that the person is saying, like in the example of the causes, you're going to get that out. And the repetition of this just basically means like going back to it, right? I don't really know what I meant by that. But okay, now another thing I want to say here is, from the statement you ask why, right? And whenever a person, see, this is also something interesting that I found out. When a person makes a statement, he has burden of proof. So this is like going to the argument of, does God exist? God exists. God doesn't exist, right? And then it's like a burden of proof is a logical fallacy also. In the video that I spoke about, I think it's called All Logical Fallacies Explained, or something like that. It's like 10 minutes long. And it talks about how a person can say, well, God exists, right? And then the other person says, God doesn't exist. And then the person that said God exists tells the person that said God doesn't exist that they don't have proof for saying that God doesn't exist, right? And see, that's a trick, because that's not fair. The person that makes the statement has the burden of proof, which means they have to be the one to show the evidence for their statement, right? Not the other person, right? That's just counter arguing the first person. So that's something that we have to keep in mind also. Um, Now, when you ask for why, you get the cause, right? The question whether or not there are other causes, right? And in this case, we have here something called the false cause fallacy, where you're trying to find the reason for that logic, right? What's behind that logic? What are the premises, or what are the causes? And there's a false cause, right? There's also a simple correlation, which is causality, right? In this case, it's just a casual correlation. Like, I think one of the famous examples they say is when it's hot, there are more ice cream sales, right? Or there was another one that said in places where there are more churches, there are also more gun stores. So then religion generates violence, right? And not exactly, it's not a direct cause, but it's a correlation. See, the problem with correlations is that they sound logical, but they're actually not, because you have to look at other factors, you have to look at other causes, right? Or the fallacy of a single cause, right? Which again, it's like, why does this happen? Well, because of this, right? And this is the only cause, right? Where it could be it could be a multi-layered problem where there are more reasons why something is happening, right? But again, those need to be discovered, those need to be analyzed, right? So in this case, we can fall maybe into a pattern of just saying, we'll just take the simple cause, we'll just take this simple idea and say this is the reason why this is happening, right? When it may not be the whole story. So basically, logic is about cause and effect, right? So when you're making the effect, which is the conclusion, based on correct causes, which are in this case, the causes, right? The initial reasons, you usually have correct logic, right? Which in this case, it's connecting the cause and the effect. You have something that I was checking out last night. You have deductive reasoning or deductive logic, where this just applies the general ideas to specific things. And then you have inductive logic or inductive reasoning, where it takes like specific examples and it looks for the general rules. So you could say inductive is basically looking for the cause, right? Whereas deductive reasoning or logic is like explaining the reason why things happen, right? And in this case, what you're doing basically is, you can even think about pointing to the future. And in terms of pointing to the future, noticing not why things happen, but how this thing in the present is going to affect things in the future, right? Now, another interesting thing I wanted to talk about here about cause and effect is, like, you can ask a person, why do you do the things you do, right? And then they can tell you, well, I do the things I do because if I don't do them, bad things are going to happen, right? I'm going to starve. I'm not going to have money, right? Like, why do you go to work? Because I need money. And if I don't have money, I'm going to basically not have a place to live in, not have food, etc. And what's interesting here is that the reason why things are usually done is because you're trying to avoid negative consequences, right? So it's interesting how, we're a society that runs on punishment. No, not on punishment, on threat, on potential punishment, right? On the threat of punishment. Like, if you don't get this done, you're gonna suffer, right? And in terms of pain and pleasure, even on the threat of pain, right? And not so much on, why do you go to work? Oh, because I love it, I enjoy it, right? Not on reward or, hope or optimism or motivation, right? But on punishment. So, or pleasure, right? And so I thought that was kind of interesting how the cause is usually negative, right? Well, it's worded negatively, right? Like, well, I work because I don't want to starve, right? I don't. So that's the negative. All right. And then we have, okay, deductive, inductive reasoning and logic, and we have abductive. Abductive in this case is the best guess or the possible best guess. Um, and I think abductive reasoning is something that we all do. It's something that we can say, well, why does this happen? We're not sure. Actually, I was seeing this graph where it had like all the types of logics or reasoning, and then it said abductive all around it. So I think abductive is like an umbrella term that encompasses all these other types of logics. And what you're basically doing is you're admitting with abductive logic that this is the potentially up to now the best cause, right? So if you're saying, why do you think it's raining? Well, because I saw rain falling from the sky, right? But I'm not sure because I'm not a master of reality. I don't know 100%, what's going on with life, etc., right? But that's the best possible guess. So this is like saying it could be true, right? Like this is what I think is the cause, right? But you're leaving room for growth and change and flexibility and maybe saying, oh, I was wrong. So this is the idea of it could be possible, right? um, but it's not unlikely, right? Or but it's not likely, right? So when something is possible, it means that it can happen. But if you say it's not likely, right? Well, that's for other things. But if you say it's not likely, basically you're saying that statistically or based on probability, it won't happen, right? But it's possible, it can happen, but it probably won't happen, right? Okay, so just to kind of finish off this video, how to win an argument, um, it boils down to presenting counter arguments, right? When the other person is making an argument or a statement. But here's a twist to this idea. When you're arguing with someone, and this is how you're supposed to write an argumentative or a persuasive essay, you're supposed to like state your opinion or whatever you think is correct, and then you're supposed to counter argue that. So you're supposed to say something that you're in favor of, right? Like, I think people should be responsible, and then destroy it, right? But I also think we need to rest. I also think we need to relax. Life is so stressful right now that we need to take a break, right? So when people are, super responsible or hyper responsible, I also think is detrimental to their health, right? And after that, you're supposed to counter argue your counter argument, right? And say, well, it could affect people's health, right? If people are always stressed out and being responsible, but it's actually something that you work for, or you work, the work you do when you're responsible is actually to benefit your health in the long run, because you're less stressed when you live in a good house, when you have a stable job, when you have family, etc., right? People to support you, right? And you do this by being responsible not only with yourself but with other people, right? So and see what I just did there. So you do that in front of the other person, right? In the face of the other person. You present like it's kind of like what Eminem did in 8 Mile, right? Like you just throw shit at yourself, and then the person's not even gonna know what to say after that, right? So you're arguing with someone, and then you just I think Chris Voss calls it an audit. I don't remember the name, but it's I think like a negativity audit. Like you just talk about all the bad stuff you have in your argument or about yourself, and then you may even counter argue those things like I mentioned, and then the person's not going to have anything else to say, right? So that's another way that you can win any argument. And yeah, of course, just remember that the logic behind people is basically going to tell you whether it's sound logic, whether it's true, whether it connects to their conclusion or it doesn't, right? And that's more than evident, right? And yeah, there's this other part which is like the so, right? The future, right? Where we can get into maybe in another video. But yeah, I just thought I'd talk about that. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the next one, right? Peace.